So against all odds, the live service initiative has continued to push along for gaming, and in fact, in some cases has been ramping up after we heard WB say that they're basically going all in on live service stuff. And Sony was kind of the same way, where they were discussing 10 or more live service games over the course of like 4 or 5 years. Well, with their recent financial report, they did talk a bit about the future of live service within PlayStation Studios, and there seemed to be quite a bit of celebrating online after what they said, but I think when you really take a look at it, what they've actually told us is the roadmap for these live service games just got a bit longer, and we're going to go over that here today. So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you're new here to the Spawn Wave channel. So first off, let's talk about exactly what was said, and this was during their recent financial report. This was from Hiroki Totoki, who is now serving basically as the head there of PlayStation, right after, of course, Jim Ryan is making his exit. That being March of 2024. They're kind of in this transitional period where it's basically handing everything off to the interim COO, CFO, head of PlayStation at this point, the president, as they then look for a new CEO, I guess, next year, as it seems that Hiroki Totoki will be at the top of PlayStation or Sony Interactive Entertainment for up to a year if needed. That's kind of the plan, but they're looking to get a new CEO, I guess, as soon as possible. However, when kind of discussing their immediate future, of course, the 12 live service games that they have planned over the next 3 years, yeah, that was going to have to come up, because 12 games in 3 years seems like a lot, especially for live service games. Well, he said, we are reviewing this. We are trying as much as possible to ensure these games are enjoyed and liked by gamers for a long time. Of the 12 titles, 6 titles will be released by fiscal year 25. That's our current plan. As for the remaining 6 titles, we are still working on that. So essentially, they went from 12 to 6. They cut their projected release schedule in half. They say that's the total number of live service and multiplayer titles, and mid to long term, we want to push this kind of service, and that's the unchanged policy of the company. It's not like we stick to certain titles, but game quality should be the most important thing. And I mean, that goes, I feel like should go without saying, although we see some odd things happen in the gaming industry that most likely is a result of deadlines that just have to be met, and money, of course, basically being burned through with development of games that I feel like these companies get 2/3 of the way, maybe even 3/4 of the way, Sega's case, the finish line for Hyenas, and they just lose confidence in its ability to stick around in a market that is incredibly competitive with live service games. And the reward, if you really figure it out and have one catch on, is incredible, as we saw with Fortnite, where they brought back the OG map. We quickly realized that a lot of people will still play Fortnite with 44.5 million people logging in a single day. When you see that kind of number and you're at the top of one of these big companies, these big publishers, yeah, you want a game that can pull that kind of interest, that kind of player base. That's one of the reasons why we see a company like Sony attempting 12 of these things. It's also very important to note here, by the way, that they've said that half of them aren't coming out in the next 2.5 years. Basically, end of fiscal year 25, right? So they're saying that would be March 2026 then, I believe. And that means that the other 6 are just pushed further into the future. So I saw celebration online around this. They're not canceling the other 6, at least not at this time. They're just pushing them out further. So the roadmap for these games are most likely going to be going until the PlayStation 6. In fact, one of these live service games, maybe multiple, could be PlayStation 6 games at this point for all we know. And there are a lot of questions around what their roadmap looks like right now with their studios. They should be still working on single-player games, as we would assume. It's Sony. It's what got them to where they are now. But this multiplayer push can't be ignored, because they seem to be very, very serious about at least getting one of these to work with intellectual property, most likely that they already have in tow, or maybe a brand new one. So, for example, all the discussion around The Last of Us multiplayer sounds like that's still in development, and maybe that's something that shows up at the end of this generation. Could be one of those 6 that got pushed out beyond March 2026. And in fact, I would kind of count on it. So, but like London Studios, we've seen like concept art for their new intellectual property multiplayer game. There's Marathon, of course. Word is that's 2025. Horizon multiplayer, which I think we had some concept art kind of thrown around out there for it, but it sounds like it might be lining up like their take sort of on a Monster Hunter kind of game. Insomniac's also working on a multiplayer game while they're still doing Wolverine. Fair Games, that's been revealed. Concord. Deviation Games, while it appeared a lot of their funding got pulled, I mean, they seem to be still trucking along. Their website has been updated consistently, and it seems like they're even hiring at this time. So I'm not really sure what's going on there. Maybe their game was pulled from them, like Sony of course went in funding it, and they would own, I guess, intellectual property. Maybe they pulled it away, maybe they pushed it out further, and Deviation Games was in kind of this weird in-between point, and they just had a bunch of staff that they didn't necessarily need at that time. And I also want to point out that the 12 live service games that they're discussing, 1 or 2 of those could be mobile phone games. I mean, they have Savage Studios, who I believe is working to basically take some of their console level games and move them over to phones. That environment is all about live service gotcha stuff. So I feel like they might be counting that as well, which, if you can really figure that out, the money there is significantly higher than anything on consoles. With that said, though, I do want to point out that Sony still should have many single player games set up. So that would be Sony Santa Monica, Naughty Dog, Insomniac, Team Asobi, Sucker Punch Ben Studio, Bluepoint, Housemarque, and apparently Media Molecule's doing something, although they might be leaning into the live service stuff at this time. After Dreams, they really, I think, need to prove themselves in terms of being able to generate revenue for Sony. But for Naughty Dog, I feel like a lot of the information coming out from them, these announcements it's just constant bad news for them, to the point where you see the Naughty Dog card, right? So, for a while with Cyberpunk, we would get that yellow card that would be shown, and it always seemed to mean that Cyberpunk was delayed again, to where it became like meme status and people would just release bad news on these yellow cards on places like Twitter. Well, Naughty Dog has done it once again, and in this case, they said our head of technology, Christian Geierling, has decided to leave Naughty Dog after an amazing 17-year career at our studio. We're grateful for his many contributions to the studio, our games, and his teammates. We will miss Christian greatly and wish him the best of luck on where his path leads next. Travis McIntosh, a 19-year veteran at Naughty Dog, will succeed Christian as head of technology. I don't really know how it necessarily affects what they're working on currently, because we don't really know what they're working on currently outside of The Last of Us multiplayer, and we assume Last of Us Part 3. But they are working on a new intellectual property, we believe. So maybe something's going on there. Again, hard to say on that, because all we really ever hear from Naughty Dog is bad news, whether it's a game being apparently shelved, but also maybe still being worked on, to people leaving. And just with Sony in general, while we see their sales rolling along for the console, it feels like there's some internal strife going on within Sony, where there's Connie Booth leaving, Jim Ryan moving on after the big live service initiative being introduced. It just seems like it's kind of all over the place behind the scenes, despite console sales and revenue seemingly at like an all-time high for them. Now, because of these delays, there would obviously be some holes in the schedule that would be created by this. Although, again, 12 live service games in the course of like 2.5 years seems like a bad idea in general, because those games are designed to sap time from the player and revenue, of course. But there's only so many hours in the day, and these live service games try to pull as much time from the player as it can. So I think spreading them out is the correct idea. But going into, say, 2024, it appears Sony will be focusing heavily on third-party support. And yeah, that's probably going to mean just exclusives that they come in and pick up. So Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, that's going to be really big for the PlayStation 5 to start off 2024. They also have Helldivers, but that would be Sony. That would be Sony's IP, with Arrowhead, I believe, working on it, who is not owned by Sony, kind of that that second party sort of thing. But then you also have Rise of the Ronin, that's apparently next year. Grand Blue Fantasy Relink, that's first quarter of next year. Stellar Blade, Silent Hill 2, Lost Soul Aside, Death Stranding 2, and there are some others thrown in there as well. Those are kind of the ones I put down here. So they are at least going to be setting up a release schedule for 2024, but I'm kind of looking at this upcoming year similar to what we saw with 2023, in that there might be one big first-party game released, like we just had Spider-Man 2, which is an awesome game, but that was kind of it, unless you really look at PSVR 2 and Horizon Call of the Mountain as the other one, and then the Horizon DLC. Sony didn't really have a great year from a first-party perspective for 2023, and I kind of feel like we're going to see a bit of a similar situation for 2024. Now, a lot of this can, of course, change. Let's say they go into 2024, and sure, they have Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Helldivers 2, but then they show up with some sort of presentation, and they lay the groundwork for the second half of this generation, which maybe includes one or two titles that they can drop in 2024 from, maybe they show Naughty Dog's new IP, or maybe Team Asobi shows up with something cool, or Sucker Punch, we assume Ghost of Tsushima 2 is waiting in the wings right now. So that's the thing currently with Sony, is their future feels very unknown right this second. And like they tend to announce games well in advance, and I know people don't necessarily like that. Now is the time, I think, to do that, because while, again, consoles are selling, I do see the confidence kind of wavering a bit online with fans of PlayStation, where they're like, okay, I have this console, I like some of the third-party games I'm getting, and Spider-Man 2 was great, but like, what's the roadmap for single-player stuff looking like? Because you're hearing a lot about live service stuff, but what do you have for people who have been sticking with PlayStation throughout this generation so far that we enjoyed with you getting to this point, right? With those big time single player narrative driven experiences. And that's something I'd like to see Sony kind of hammer out here and give people an idea as to this, the broad picture of what they're planning for the second half of the PS5. But let me know what you think about this down below. The live service initiative continues on, but it's just going to take a bit longer, it seems, with those 12 live service games, I guess, being spread out over the course of the rest of this generation, and probably even into the PlayStation 6 generation. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.